There's a name in Japan that men still whisper with a kind of awe, even after nearly 1,000 years. Benkei. Just 2 syllables, but they carry the weight of mountains, the clash of steel, and the smell of incense burning in old temple halls. He wasn't a king. He wasn't an emperor. He didn't sit on a throne or sign treaties that shaped nations. And yet his shadow stretches longer than most of the men who did. There's a reason for that, and it's a reason worth understanding before any of his story makes sense. See, the strange thing about Benkei is that nobody can quite agree on where he came from. Some say his mother carried him for 18 long months before he was finally born, which already tells you the kind of legend we're stepping into. Others claim his father wasn't a man at all, but a temple deity, or worse, a demon who'd taken human shape for one fateful night. Folks back then didn't separate history from myth the way modern people do. To them, the line between the two was as thin as rice paper and just as easy to tear. Now picture Japan in the late 1100s. It's a land of misty mountains, lantern-lit villages, and powerful warrior clans circling each other like wolves. The emperor sits in Kyoto, but real power is shifting into the hands of armed men who answer to nobody. Buddhist temples have become fortresses. Monks carry swords as easily as prayer beads. And somewhere in this thunderstorm of a century, a child is born who will grow into something the world has never seen before, and arguably has never seen since. The old stories say he came into this world already enormous, hair down to his shoulders, a full set of teeth in his mouth, eyes that didn't blink the way a baby's eyes should. His mother is said to have been terrified, his father even more so. They didn't see a son. They saw something else, something that didn't quite belong to the world of men. And whether that's literal truth or poetic exaggeration, one thing is certain. From his very first breath, Benkei was marked as different, and in those days, different was dangerous. That's the soil his legend grew out of. Not a palace, not a battlefield victory, not a noble bloodline, just a strange, towering child born under strange circumstances, in a strange and violent age with a destiny nobody around him could yet imagine. But the people who watched him grow began to suspect something they couldn't quite name. Something that would only become clear when the boy himself started to discover what he was truly capable of, and what the world around him was about to learn the hard way. The boy grew, but he didn't grow the way other boys did. By the time most children his age were still chasing fireflies and tripping over their own sandals, young Benkei was already taller than grown men. His shoulders stretched wider every season. His hands could wrap around tree trunks the way other kids wrapped theirs around rice bowls, and his voice rumbled out of him like distant thunder rolling down a mountain. The village folk didn't know what to make of him. They'd stop mid-conversation when he walked past, and they'd cross to the other side of the road when they could. Japan in the late 1100s believed deeply in spirits, in curses, in the unseen world pressing against the seen one. A child who looked unnatural was often blamed for crop failures, sick livestock, sudden deaths, anything the village couldn't explain. And Benkei, with his towering frame, his wild dark hair, and those piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through a person, became the easiest target for every whisper, every superstition, and every fearful glance thrown in his direction. He didn't have to do a thing. His existence alone was enough. Stories started circulating about him before he was even old enough to defend himself. Some said he'd been seen lifting boulders no grown man could budge. Others swore they'd watched him bend the iron rim of a cartwheel with his bare hands, just to see if he could. Whether these tales were true or stretched a little in the telling, they spread fast, the way frightening stories always do. Pretty soon, mothers were warning their children not to wander near him, and fathers were sharpening their tools just in case. The boy who hadn't asked to be born this way was already being treated like a threat to be managed. And here's the part that stings. The part anyone who's ever felt out of place can understand on a bone-deep level. His own family started pulling away from him. They didn't say it out loud, of course. They didn't have to. It showed up in the small things. The way his mother flinched when he reached out to her. The way his father stopped meeting his eyes at dinner. The way the household grew quieter and colder around him with each passing year. Imagine being a child, a real child, with a real heart inside that enormous chest, and slowly realizing the people who were supposed to love you most are the ones most afraid of you. That's the kind of wound that shapes a man. Not the bruises from a fistfight, not the cuts from a blade, but the slow, silent rejection of being unwanted in your own home. Benkei carried that wound with him, even as his body grew stronger and his strange gifts became impossible to ignore. And his family, unable to handle the boy they'd brought into the world, began searching for somewhere, anywhere, to send him. A place where his size and his strangeness might become someone else's problem. A place where he might be forged into something useful, or at the very least, kept far away from the village that no longer wanted him. The decision came on a quiet morning, the kind of morning where the mist still clings to the rooftops and the birds haven't quite figured out what to sing yet. Benkei's family had reached the end of their rope. They couldn't raise him, couldn't tame him, couldn't even pretend to understand him anymore. So they did what countless families in feudal Japan did with sons they couldn't handle. They sent him to the mountains. They sent him to a temple. They handed him over to the monks and walked away, telling themselves it was for his own good, when really, deep down, they knew it was for theirs. The place he was taken to wasn't a peaceful little shrine tucked into a hillside, the kind you see in postcards. This was a Sohei temple, a stronghold of warrior monks who chanted scripture by morning and trained with naginata polearms by afternoon. These men weren't gentle souls in flowing robes whispering prayers. They were hardened, disciplined, and dangerous. Men who'd long ago figured out that in a country tearing itself apart, even monks needed to know how to break a man in two. And into this brotherhood walked a boy who already looked like a grown warrior. And they took one good look at him and saw raw material. The training was brutal. There's no soft way to say it. Days started before sunrise with freezing water poured over the head. Hours of meditation that turned a young boy's legs to stone. Recitation of sutras until his throat went raw. And then, when most boys would already be exhausted, the real work began. Wooden staffs, naginata drills, hand-to-hand grappling on cold stone floors, climbing mountain paths with heavy loads strapped to the back. If a boy collapsed, he was kicked back up. If he cried, he was given more. Mercy wasn't part of the curriculum. Forging a man was. And here's where something interesting started happening. The very things that had made Benkei a curse in his village, his size, his strength, his strangeness, became his greatest assets inside those temple walls. What the villagers had feared, the monks respected. What his family had recoiled from, his teachers harnessed. For the first time in his life, the boy who'd been treated like a monster was being treated like a man with potential. And anyone who's ever felt out of place finally finding the room they were meant to walk into knows exactly what that does to a person. It changes everything. But don't think for a second that this was some heartwarming tale of belonging. The temple wasn't a family, and the monks weren't father figures. They were drill instructors with prayer beads. They demanded obedience, silence, and total submission to the rules of the order. And Benkei, well, Benkei was many things, but obedient wasn't really high on the list. He absorbed the training like a sponge. He grew faster and stronger than anyone they'd ever seen. But underneath it all, something restless was building in him. Something that didn't quite fit inside the walls of a monastery. Something that would, sooner or later, have to come out. For a while, things actually worked. The temple gave Benkei what his home never had, a place where his strength was useful, where his size was an asset, where the men around him pushed him instead of pulling away from him. He poured himself into the training, mastered the naginata faster than any trainee before him, memorized the scriptures, and earned a reputation that started spreading from temple to temple across the region. Word got around. There's a giant up in the mountains, a boy who fights like 10 men, a monk who can split a wooden post in a single swing. Folks were starting to talk again, but this time the whispers had a very different flavor. But here's the thing about a temple, especially a Sohei temple in those days. It wasn't just a school, it was a hierarchy, a brotherhood, a strict order with rules carved deeper than the stones in the courtyard. Everything had a place, everything had a procedure, and every monk was expected to fall in line. Show up here, pray there, eat this, wear that, speak only when spoken to, and obey the master in all things. For some men, that kind of structure is a comfort. It gives them peace. It gives them purpose. It tells them exactly who they are and what to do. But for Benkei, that same structure started feeling more and more like a cage. He'd begun questioning things. Why this ritual? Why that rule? Why bow to a master who couldn't outfight him? Why chant words his mind already understood better than the men leading the chant? He didn't ask these questions out loud, not at first. He was smart enough to know that asking the wrong question in the wrong tone could earn you a beating from the senior monks. But the questions piled up inside him anyway, the way water builds up behind a dam. And anyone who's ever sat in a room and felt themselves growing too big for the space around them knows that water doesn't stay behind a dam forever. The clashes started small. A missed bow here, a late arrival there, a sharp word back to a senior monk who'd corrected him in front of the others. Each incident was minor on its own, the kind of thing that would have earned a normal trainee a slap and a warning. But Benkei wasn't a normal trainee. He was already bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than the men trying to discipline him, and they knew it. Every confrontation became a quiet test, a delicate dance between authority and raw power. And with every passing month, the temple leaders found themselves losing more ground than they were willing to admit. And then came the breaking point. Nobody remembers the exact incident, the way nobody really remembers the exact straw that breaks the camel's back. Maybe it was a fight that went too far. Maybe it was a refusal that crossed an unspoken line. Maybe it was just Benkei realizing one quiet morning that he'd outgrown the place that had raised him. Whatever it was, he walked out. He left behind the prayer beads and the daily routines, kept the discipline burned into his bones, and stepped into a world that was about to meet a wandering warrior unlike anything it had seen before. A monk without a temple, a weapon without a master, a storm looking for somewhere to land. A young man, barely out of his teenage years, taller than any soldier in the land, stronger than any wrestler the region had ever produced, walking down from the mountains with a naginata strapped to his back and no master to answer to. He drifted into the city of Kyoto, the beating heart of Imperial Japan, a place packed with nobles, merchants, monks, samurai, beggars, and every flavor of human in between. And for the first time in his life, he wandered without a destination. No temple bell calling him to prayer. No master barking out orders. Just the open streets of the capital and a quiet hunger to figure out where a man like him belonged in a world like this. One evening, he ducked into a small nomiya, one of those low-roofed neighborhood taverns where farmers, travelers, and tired workers gathered to drink sake and trade stories at the end of a long day. Benkei sat in the corner, nursing a cup, keeping to himself and watching. And what he saw didn't sit right with him. At a long wooden table near the center of the room, a group of samurai had taken over the place, drunk on rice wine and full of themselves, shouting at the elderly owner, slapping the serving girls, mocking a quiet old farmer who just wanted a meal after a long day in the fields. Their swords rested on their hips, polished and proud, the symbols of a warrior class that was supposed to protect the people. Supposed to. Benkei watched the swords more than he watched the men. He'd been raised on stories of Bushido, the way of the warrior, the code of honor, loyalty, and discipline that was meant to separate a true samurai from a common bully. But the men in front of him weren't living any code. They were just thugs with expensive blades, men who'd been handed power they hadn't earned and used it to make weaker people miserable. And something inside him, something that had been simmering ever since he was a fearful child, watching his own village whisper about him, came quietly to a boil. He'd been the outcast. He'd been the one feared and judged. And now he was watching the so-called honorable men of Japan abuse the very people they'd sworn to protect. That night, walking home along the Kamo River, Benkei made himself a promise. A strange, obsessive, almost poetic promise. If these samurai wouldn't honor their swords, then he would take their swords from them. One by one, until they understood what it meant to lose the thing they hadn't deserved in the first place. He set himself a number, the kind of impossible figure only a young man with fire in his chest could come up with. 1,000 swords, 1,000 humbled men, 1,000 quiet lessons delivered on a wooden bridge under lantern light. He'd be the toll booth of Kyoto, and the price of crossing would be the very steel they'd dishonored. So night after night, Benkei stationed himself on the famous Gojo Bridge that arched over the Kamo River. Any samurai who tried to cross had to face him. If they won, they walked away. If they lost, and they almost always lost, they handed over their blade. That sword went onto Benkei's growing pile, and the defeated warrior limped off into the night a little lighter and a lot more humble. Word spread through Kyoto faster than smoke through dry grass. There was a monstrous monk out on the bridge taking blades from arrogant samurai, and the count was climbing fast. He hit 900, then 950, then 999. One more sword, and his strange promise would be complete. What he got that final night, though, was something so small and so unexpected that it would crack the entire foundation of who he thought he was. The night Benkei stood on the Gojo Bridge waiting for his 1,000th sword, he wasn't expecting much of a fight. 999 men had already failed against him, and most of them had been seasoned warriors twice his age and half his strength. So when he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching from the far end of the bridge, light and quick like a deer crossing a stream, he barely bothered to turn his head. The lantern light flickered, the mist rolled, and out of the darkness stepped a figure so small, so slender, so almost delicate, that Benkei nearly laughed out loud. This wasn't a warrior. This was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 15 or 16 years old. He wore a long traveling cloak that swallowed his thin frame, a wide hat pulled low over his face, and at his hip rested a single katana that looked almost too big for him. He moved across the bridge with an odd, almost musical grace, the kind of walk you'd expect from a dancer rather than a swordsman. And as Benkei looked down at this tiny figure approaching him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not threat, not respect, just a quiet, amused puzzlement. The kind that comes right before a man realizes he's about to be humbled in ways he never imagined. Benkei stepped forward, naginata in hand, and gave the boy the courtesy of a warning. Turn around. Go home. Hand over your sword if you must, but don't waste both of our time pretending you can fight. The boy didn't speak. He didn't bow. He didn't even stop walking. He just kept moving forward with that strange dancer's grace. And when he was close enough, he tilted his head slightly, looked up from under the brim of his hat, and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a polite smile. A smile that said, "You have no idea what's about to happen to you." And then he drew his sword. What followed wasn't really a fight in the way most fights are. It was more like watching a hurricane try to catch a single falling leaf. Benkei swung. The boy wasn't there. Benkei lunged. The boy was already behind him. Benkei brought down his naginata in a strike that could have split a horse in half, and the boy was 3 steps to the side, looking almost bored. Every move Benkei made, the boy answered before it had even finished forming. The bridge that had hosted 999 humiliations was now hosting Benkei's own, and the giant who had never lost was suddenly, impossibly, swinging at empty air. It ended exactly how the boy wanted it to end. With a single light tap of the flat of his sword against Benkei's massive shoulder, a tap so gentle it was almost insulting, the kind of touch a teacher gives a slow student to bring him back to attention. Benkei stood there, breathing hard, his naginata heavy in his hands, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd lost. For the first time in his entire life as a fighter, he'd been completely, utterly, undeniably defeated. And the boy, who'd done it, was standing in front of him with that same calm smile, waiting to see what this giant would do next. Because something far more important than a duel was about to take place on that bridge. Something that would bind Benkei to one name for the rest of his life. Now here's where the story takes a turn that most folks today have a hard time wrapping their heads around. Because what happened next on that bridge wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It wasn't a giant licking his wounds and stomping off into the night to plot revenge. Benkei did something almost no man in his position would have done. He looked at the boy who'd just beaten him. This slender teenager half his size with a sword that should have been too big for his arms. And he saw something the rest of the world hadn't yet noticed. He saw greatness. Real, undeniable, once-in-a-generation greatness. And in that moment, Benkei understood exactly what he was supposed to do. He knelt. Right there on the wooden planks of the Gojo Bridge, with 999 swords stacked away in some hidden storeroom, with his entire reputation as the unbeatable monster of Kyoto sitting in pieces around him. He lowered his massive frame to the ground. He bowed his head, and he offered his life, his strength, and his service to the boy standing in front of him. The boy's name, by the way, was Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a name most folks back then hadn't heard yet, but a name that would soon echo through every corner of Japan and into the history books for nearly 1,000 years to come. Now, to a modern ear, this might sound strange. A grown warrior swearing eternal loyalty to a teenager he just met on a bridge. Today, men spend years deciding whether to commit to a gym membership, let alone a lifelong bond. But in the world Benkei lived in, this was the highest form of meaning a man could find. To pledge oneself to a worthy master wasn't weakness. It was the very definition of strength. A samurai without a lord was a leaf without a tree, drifting wherever the wind took him. And Benkei, after years of drifting, of fighting, of collecting swords like a man trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled, had finally found his tree. And Yoshitsune, for his part, accepted. He didn't gloat. He didn't lecture. He didn't make a big speech about how he'd known all along he would win. He simply nodded, helped Benkei to his feet, and from that night forward, the two were inseparable. Wherever Yoshitsune went, Benkei walked behind him, naginata in hand, eyes scanning every shadow for threat. The giant who had once terrorized the bridges of Kyoto now served as the loyal shadow of a young man most people initially dismissed as too small, too pretty, too refined to ever amount to anything. And anyone who underestimated the pair quickly learned the cost of that mistake. There's something worth pausing on here, something deeper than just a samurai story. Because what Benkei found that night wasn't just a master, it was a purpose. For the first time since he'd been a strange, oversized boy in a fearful village, he knew exactly who he was and what he was for. The loneliness, the rejection, the years of drifting, all of it suddenly made sense, because all of it had been preparing him to become the shield, the sword, and the silent guardian of a man worth protecting. And that kind of clarity, that kind of meaning, is what every man secretly hungers for. Whether he's living in feudal Japan or driving home from work in the year we're all living in now. To understand what comes next in Benkei's story, a man's got to step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because while Benkei and Yoshitsune were forming their unlikely bond on that lantern-lit bridge, the entire country of Japan was sitting on a powder keg. Two enormous warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, had been circling each other like wolves for decades, each one hungry for control of the imperial throne, each one convinced they were destined to rule. And by the late 1170s, that simmering rivalry was about to boil over into one of the most brutal civil wars Japan had ever seen, a conflict history would later call the Genpei War. Now here's a detail that changes everything. Yoshitsune, the slender boy who just humbled the unbeatable monk of the Gojo Bridge, wasn't just some wandering teenager with a fancy sword. He was a Minamoto. His father had been killed years earlier when the Taira clan crushed an earlier rebellion, and young Yoshitsune had been raised in hiding, shipped off to a remote temple where the Taira hoped he'd grow up forgotten. They were wrong. He didn't grow up forgotten. He grew up hungry. Hungry for revenge, hungry for restoration, hungry to reclaim his family's name. And by the time he met Benkei on that bridge, that hunger had sharpened into something dangerous. So when news arrived that Yoshitsune's older half-brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, was raising an army in the east to finally strike back at the Taira, the slender swordsman didn't hesitate. He answered the call. He left the shadows behind, climbed onto a horse, and rode east to join his brother's growing rebellion. And of course, where Yoshitsune went, Benkei went too. The giant who'd once stood alone on a bridge collecting steel from arrogant samurai now rode alongside the most extraordinary warrior of his generation, heading straight into the heart of a war that would shake every mountain, every village, and every imperial hall in Japan. The Genpei War wasn't a polite affair. It wasn't men in clean armor exchanging measured blows on neat battlefields. It was burning villages, naval clashes in cold gray waters, mountain ambushes, broken oaths, and bodies piling up so fast that entire rivers ran red with what came next. The Taira had ruled Japan for years through wealth, refinement, and political maneuvering. The Minamoto, hardened by exile and loss, came at them like a pack of starving wolves through a snowstorm. And in the middle of this storm, riding behind a young commander barely out of his teens, was Benkei, naginata in hand, more loyal than any blade had ever been to its master. Now he was about to test that purpose in the bloodiest, most chaotic theater Japan had ever seen, and the battles ahead would either prove his loyalty was real or grind it into dust. Because the first true test was already on the horizon, and it had a name that would echo through history. The first real test came at a place called Ichi-no-Tani, a stretch of rugged coastline where the Taira had built what they thought was an impenetrable fortress, nestled between the sea on one side and steep cliffs on the other. To the average commander, attacking such a position would have been suicide. The cliffs were too steep for cavalry, the beach too narrow for a frontal assault, and the Taira had numbers, supplies, and the comfort of fighting on familiar ground. Yoshitsune looked at the same fortress and saw something nobody else saw. He saw a back door. He saw a way down those cliffs, and he saw a chance to do what no man was supposed to be able to do. So he split his army, sent the main force to attack from the front, and personally led a small group of riders, Benkei among them, up the steep mountains behind the Taira position. They climbed at night, through cold mist and loose stone, leading their horses by hand along paths that mountain goats would have thought twice about. And then, at dawn, Yoshitsune did something that's been argued about for nearly 1,000 years. He looked down at the sheer cliff above the Taira camp and ordered his men to ride straight down it, on horseback. A drop steep enough that one wrong move meant horse and rider tumbling to certain death. The Taira never saw it coming. One minute they were sipping morning tea, certain of their security. The next minute, Minamoto cavalry were thundering down the impossible cliff above them like demons falling out of the sky. Panic spread through the Taira camp faster than fire through dry grass. Soldiers grabbed weapons that didn't matter. Commanders shouted orders that didn't reach anyone. And in the middle of that chaos, towering above the rest of the attacking force, was Benkei, naginata in hand, cutting through enemy ranks like a man clearing brush from a path. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't fighting for revenge. He was fighting because Yoshitsune was up ahead. And where Yoshitsune went, Benkei went. Ichi no Tani was only the beginning. Months later came Yashima, where Yoshitsune again pulled off the impossible, crossing a stormy sea with a small force when no other commander would have risked it, surprising the Taira from a direction they hadn't bothered to defend. And then came Dan no Ura, the final, catastrophic naval battle where the Taira clan was effectively wiped out, their warships burned and broken across the waters of the Shimonoseki Strait. Battle after battle, Yoshitsune proved he wasn't just a clever commander. He was a once-in-a-century military mind, the kind that comes along maybe 2 or 3 times in 1,000 years. And right behind him, in every fight, stood his giant. Now here's the part that mattered most to Benkei, and it has very little to do with sword strikes or naval tactics. Through every one of those battles, through fire and steel and freezing seawater, he was finally living the truth his entire strange life had been preparing him for. The orphaned monster, the temple rebel, the bridge keeper, the man who'd spent years searching for something to be loyal to. All of it had been pointing him toward this, toward fighting beside a worthy lord, toward being trusted with the most valuable life on the battlefield, toward becoming the legend folks would still whisper about 1,000 years later. And just when it seemed like nothing could ever break the bond he'd built or the future he was building, the storm shifted. And it came not from an enemy clan, but from inside his master's own family. Most folks expect the villain in a story like this to wear black armor and carry a cursed sword. Reality, unfortunately, is usually quieter and a whole lot uglier than that. Because the man who would bring down everything Benkei had fought to build wasn't a Taira warlord. He wasn't a foreign invader. He wasn't even a stranger. He was Yoshitsune's own older half-brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo, the very man whose army Yoshitsune had just helped lead to total victory. And the weapon Yoritomo used wasn't a blade. It was something far more dangerous in the wrong hands. Suspicion, jealousy, and the cold political instincts of a man who just realized he was no longer the most famous Minamoto in Japan. Now, to understand what happened, a man's got to grasp something about power. The moment you have it, you become deeply afraid of losing it. And Yoritomo, sitting up in his eastern stronghold of Kamakura, while Yoshitsune was out winning battle after battle in his name, started hearing something he didn't like. The cheers, the songs, the whispered stories spreading through every village about the brilliant young commander and his giant warrior monk. People weren't praising Yoritomo. They were praising his little brother. And for a man who'd spent his entire adult life clawing his way to the top of the Minamoto clan, that kind of admiration directed somewhere else felt like a knife sliding slowly between his ribs. There were other complications too, the kind that make politics in any era look the same. Yoshitsune, brilliant on the battlefield but politically naive, had accepted court titles directly from the emperor without first asking his older brother for permission. To a younger sibling, it probably felt like a small thing. To Yoritomo, sitting up in Kamakura, it looked like a betrayal of the family hierarchy, a younger brother going around him to make himself look bigger. The advisors whispered in his ear. The court intrigues spun their webs. And one day, an order went out from Kamakura that would change everything. Yoshitsune was no longer a war hero. Yoshitsune was now an enemy of the state. You can imagine what that news must have felt like when it reached Yoshitsune. The young commander who just risked his life over and over again for his brother's cause was suddenly being hunted by that same brother's soldiers. The titles he'd accepted were stripped. The lands he'd been promised were taken back. The loyalty he'd shown was repaid with a price on his head. And in a country where political survival meant either bowing low or running fast, Yoshitsune found himself with very few friends and even fewer options. Most of his former allies turned away the moment Yoritomo's order arrived. Most, but not all. Because standing right beside him, exactly where he'd been since the night on the Gojo Bridge, was Benkei. There's something worth pausing on here. Something every man who's ever been tested by hard times can recognize. When the easy days are gone, you find out real quick who your real people are. The fair-weather friends vanish, the loyal ones stay. And what made Benkei truly extraordinary wasn't his size, wasn't his strength, wasn't even the 1,000 swords he'd once collected on a Kyoto bridge. It was the fact that when the entire country turned against his master, when staying loyal meant being hunted, broke, and likely dead within a year, he didn't even hesitate. He picked up his naginata. He gathered the few supplies they had, and he started walking north with Yoshitsune into the long, dangerous, beautiful loneliness of exile. The kind of journey that would test a man's loyalty in ways no battlefield ever could. So began one of the most remarkable chapters in Benkei's entire story, and honestly, one of the most human. Because for all the talk of battles and bridges and 1,000 swords, what happened next wasn't about fighting at all. It was about survival. Yoshitsune, once the most celebrated commander in all of Japan, was now a hunted fugitive with a price on his head, and the entire machinery of the state was bent on finding him. And so the small band of loyal followers, led by Benkei, began a long, desperate journey north toward the one region where they might still find shelter, far from Yoritomo's reach. The Japan they traveled through was not a friendly place for men in their position. Every checkpoint was a threat. Every village could hold an informant. Every traveling monk or merchant they passed on the road might recognize the famous young commander or the giant who walked beside him, and a single whisper to the wrong ear could bring soldiers down on them within hours. So they traveled carefully, quietly, often in disguise, moving through mountain passes and forgotten trails, sleeping in temples when they were welcome, and in the open wilderness when they weren't. The man who'd once stood proud on the Gojo Bridge now kept his head down and his hood up. Now here's where Benkei's character really came into focus, because survival on a journey like this took far more than muscle. It took cleverness. It took patience. It took the ability to swallow pride and play a role. And Benkei, the giant who'd never backed down from anyone, proved he could do exactly that. He took on the disguise of a humble traveling monk, leading a small group of pilgrims through the countryside, a role that let them move from region to region without drawing too much suspicion. He learned to bow his head, soften his voice, and shrink himself, as much as a man his size possibly could, into something that wouldn't make people look twice. But there's a quiet kind of heartbreak in this part of the story. The kind that men who've lived a few decades understand better than most. Because Benkei and Yoshitsune weren't running toward a bright future. They were running away from a death sentence, with no guarantee of safety on the other side. Every mile north was a mile further from the glory they'd known, from the battles they'd won, from the world that had once celebrated them. They were two men who'd touched the very heights of fame and triumph, now reduced to creeping through the shadows, hoping nobody recognized their faces. And through all of it, Benkei never once wavered, never once suggested they go their separate ways to improve their odds. Think about what that kind of loyalty actually costs. It would have been so easy for Benkei to slip away in the night. He could have shed the disguise, walked into any province, and started a new life. With his skills, his strength, and his reputation, he could have found work, found belonging, found safety. Yoritomo wasn't hunting Benkei. He was hunting Yoshitsune. Benkei could have walked away clean, but he didn't. He stayed. Mile after mile, day after day, he stayed. Because to Benkei, loyalty wasn't something you offered when it was convenient and withdrew when it got hard. It was the whole point. And as the long road north stretched on, that loyalty was about to face its most famous test of all, at a checkpoint that would become legend. The day eventually came when the small band of fugitives found themselves approaching a place called Ataka, a heavily guarded checkpoint set up specifically to catch travelers who didn't belong. The barrier sat right across the only viable road north, manned by a sharp-eyed officer named Togashi, a man whose job was very simple. Find Yoshitsune, capture him, send his head back to Yoritomo. Every face that passed through Ataka was studied. Every story was tested. Every traveler was a suspect until proven otherwise. And the group walking up the road that day, no matter how convincing their disguise, was going to need more than just luck to make it through. Benkei had a plan. Or maybe more accurately, Benkei had the courage to improvise something so risky that even thinking about it made the rest of the group's mouths go dry. The group would pose as a band of traveling monks raising funds to rebuild a famous temple. Benkei himself would lead them, carrying a scroll he'd quickly written that morning, supposedly a sacred list of donors and prayers. And Yoshitsune, the most recognizable face in all of Japan at that moment, would walk among them as the most humble member of the group, a lowly porter carrying baggage on his back, head down, identity hidden behind the simplest disguise of all, a man too unimportant to notice. When they reached the barrier, Togashi questioned Benkei sharply. Who were they? Where were they headed? What was the temple they claimed to be raising money for? Benkei, with the calm of a man who had spent years memorizing Buddhist texts in a temple of his own, answered every single question without flinching. Then, when Togashi pressed harder and asked Benkei to read aloud from the so-called subscription scroll, Benkei did something legendary. He unrolled the blank piece of paper, lifted it before him, and recited a long, eloquent, completely fabricated text from memory, weaving real Buddhist phrases and made-up details into something that sounded utterly authentic. Togashi listened in stunned silence, but Togashi wasn't a fool. As the group began to pass through, his eyes lingered on one of the porters, a small, slender, almost too graceful figure, with his head bowed beneath a wide hat. Something about the way he carried himself didn't quite fit a common laborer. Togashi's hand began to drift toward his sword, and in that moment, Benkei did the most shocking thing a loyal vassal could possibly do. He turned around, raised his walking staff, and started beating the porter, his own beloved master, right there in front of the guards. He shouted insults at him. He called him slow. He called him lazy. He treated him with the kind of contempt only a higher-ranking monk would dare show to the lowliest member of a temple group. Togashi stared. The other guards stared, and in that frozen moment, the impossible happened. Togashi understood. He understood that the lowly porter was Yoshitsune. He understood that the giant beating him was Benkei. And he understood that what he was watching was not cruelty, but the deepest, most painful act of loyalty he had ever seen, a faithful servant willing to strike his own master in public, knowing full well the lifelong shame it would bring him, just to save that master's life. So Togashi, moved beyond words by what he was witnessing, did the only honorable thing left. He waved the group through. He let them pass. And as the small band walked away from Ataka, every man in it knew that the moment Benkei had just lived through would echo through Japanese history forever. The road north eventually came to its end. After years of running, hiding, and surviving by their wits, Yoshitsune and Benkei finally reached the northern province of Mutsu, where a powerful lord named Fujiwara no Hidehira had agreed to give them shelter. For a brief moment, it looked like the storm might have passed. Hidehira was old, wealthy, and influential enough to keep them safe from Yoritomo's reach. And for a few quiet years, Yoshitsune and Benkei lived something close to a normal life inside the protection of Hidehira's estate. No battles, no chases, just the slow rhythm of a peace they hadn't tasted since they were boys. But peace built on the protection of one old man is a fragile thing. When Hidehira finally died, his son and successor, Yasuhira, was nothing like his father. Where the old lord had been a man of honor, the son was a man of ambition. And when Yoritomo sent word from Kamakura, demanding that Yasuhira hand over Yoshitsune or face the full wrath of the Minamoto, the young heir didn't hesitate for long. He chose his own skin over his father's promise. He gathered his soldiers, raised his banners, and marched on the small estate at Koromogawa, where Yoshitsune and Benkei had been quietly living. The trap had finally closed. When the attack came, Yoshitsune and Benkei were inside the small main house of the estate, along with Yoshitsune's wife, their young child, and a handful of remaining retainers. There was no chance of victory. The attacking force outnumbered them by hundreds to one, surrounding the estate on every side. There was no escape route, no reinforcements coming, no clever trick that could save them this time. Just a small house, a few loyal swords, and the certainty that this was the end. And in that final moment, Benkei made a choice that would seal his place in Japanese legend for the rest of time. He stepped outside, alone. With his naginata in hand and his master sealed safely inside the house behind him, the giant warrior monk planted himself in the open ground in front of the building, the only thing standing between Yoshitsune and the army that had come to kill him. He was buying time. He knew it. Yoshitsune knew it. Every man in that estate knew it. Because samurai tradition demanded that a defeated lord be given the dignity of taking his own life on his own terms, rather than being slaughtered in front of his family. And so Benkei stood there, in the cold morning air, to give his master that final, precious gift: time. Yasuhira's soldiers came at him in waves, and Benkei cut them down. Sword after sword, archer after archer, the bodies piled up around his feet. The giant who had collected 999 swords on a Kyoto bridge so many years ago was now writing one last impossible chapter, refusing to fall, refusing to step aside, refusing to let a single soldier reach the door behind him. Inside the house, Yoshitsune was preparing himself, calmly, deliberately, to do what had to be done. And outside, his giant kept fighting, kept guarding, kept buying the minutes his master needed. But minutes have a cost, and the arrows had already begun to find him. What happened next is the moment Japan never forgot, the image that historians and storytellers have been trying to capture for nearly 1,000 years. Because as the arrows kept coming, finding their mark over and over again, Benkei did not fall. He should have. By every law of biology, by every measure of what a human body can absorb, he should have crumpled to the ground long before the assault ended. But Benkei wasn't operating by ordinary laws anymore. He was operating on something deeper, something fiercer, something that had been forged in him from the first time he'd been called a monster as a child. He was operating on pure, unbreakable will. His naginata stayed in his hands. His feet stayed planted in the snow. His massive frame, now pierced by what witnesses described as dozens of arrows, became almost a hedgehog of feathered shafts sticking out from his shoulders, his chest, his thighs, his arms. Blood ran down his armor and pooled at his feet, but he didn't drop the weapon. He didn't kneel. He didn't even sway. The soldiers in front of him slowed their advance, then stopped completely, every one of them staring at the impossible sight in front of them. A man so full of arrows he looked more pincushion than monk, still standing, still gripping his weapon, still guarding the door behind him. And then, somewhere in those frozen minutes, Benkei died. But here's the thing that no one watching could believe at first. His body didn't fall. He died on his feet, his hands still locked around the wooden shaft of his naginata, his legs still locked in their fighting stance, his lifeless body refusing to do the one thing all dying bodies eventually do: give up gravity. The soldiers stared. The wind moved through his torn robes. Snow continued to fall, and for a long stretch of time that no one in that field would ever forget, no soldier dared approach. Because none of them could be certain whether the giant was actually dead. This is the moment that Japanese culture has preserved for nearly 1,000 years now. They even have a phrase for it in the language: Benkei no tachi ojo, which translates roughly to the standing death of Benkei. It's still used today to describe any situation where someone refuses to give up even after they've technically been defeated, where pride and will hold a body upright long after the body itself has lost the right to stand. It's a phrase that captures something deeply Japanese about endurance, loyalty, and the refusal to let circumstances dictate one's dignity. And it all comes back to one giant, standing in the snow, guarding a door. Eventually, of course, a soldier had to confirm what they were all already starting to suspect. Carefully, almost reverently, one of them approached the towering figure and gave it a slight push, and only then did Benkei's body finally fall. Inside the house, Yoshitsune had already done what samurai tradition required of him. His master had been given the gift of an honorable death because his giant had bought him every second of time it took to perform it. The mission Benkei had set himself on the Gojo Bridge nearly a decade earlier, to be the shield, the sword, and the silent guardian of a man worth protecting, had been completed in full. And in the silence of that snowy morning, a 1,000-year legend was born. Inside the house, Yoshitsune had spared his young wife and child the cruelty of capture before turning the blade on himself, a final act of love hidden inside the samurai code of his time. And outside, his giant lay finally still in the bloodied snow, his mission complete. By any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the story. A loyal vassal dies guarding his master. A defeated commander takes his own life. The bodies are buried, the swords are collected, and history moves on to the next chapter. But Benkei's story didn't move on. It didn't fade. It didn't get filed away in some dusty scroll for scholars to argue about. It became something far stranger and far more powerful than any of the men who lived through it could have imagined. Within a few generations, Benkei was no longer just a historical figure. He had become a symbol. Traveling storytellers carried his name from village to village, growing his deeds with each retelling, until the Bridge of 1,000 Swords, the trick at Ataka, and the standing death at Koromagawa became as familiar to the Japanese imagination as the stories of King Arthur are to the Western mind. Buddhist priests wove his loyalty into sermons about duty and devotion. Mothers told their sons about him as an example of the kind of man worth becoming. And the giant who'd once been called a monster as a child became one of the most beloved figures in an entire culture's identity. Then came the theater. Kabuki and no playwrights got their hands on the story and never let it go. The scene at Ataka Barrier, where Benkei beat his own master to save him, became one of the most famous and most performed plays in Japanese history. A drama called Kanjincho, still staged in major theaters across Japan today, recreates that moment for modern audiences who weep at it just as their great-grandparents did. And in every performance, in every kabuki house, in every echo of those wooden floors, the name of Benkei lives again, generation after generation, refusing to die just like the man himself refused to fall. His influence spread even further into the language itself. There's a phrase in Japanese, nakidokoro, which roughly translates to the place where Benkei wept. It refers to a person's hidden weakness, the one vulnerable spot in even the strongest character, because legend says that the only thing that could ever make the mighty Benkei cry was a sharp blow to the shin. There's also Benkei no Tachi Ojo, the standing death we already talked about, used today whenever someone refuses to surrender, even when they've technically been beaten. A man's name became part of how an entire nation describes endurance, vulnerability, and dignity. That's not history. That's immortality. So what does Benkei's story leave a man with? Especially a man old enough to know that life keeps testing what we're really made of. It leaves something worth holding on to. The world will tell you that strength is about winning, that loyalty is about convenience, that meaning is something you discover at a seminar. Benkei would have laughed at all of it. He'd tell you that real strength shows up when you've already lost, that real loyalty proves itself when staying costs you everything, and that real meaning is something you build day after day, by standing where you're supposed to stand, even when the arrows are flying. He'd tell you that any man, no matter how lonely his beginnings or how scarred his past, can become the kind of person whose name still gets whispered 1,000 years after he's gone. All it takes is the courage to pick something worth protecting, and then to never, ever let go.
That's the end of this video. Would you like to see more of it? I hope so. Let me know in the comments.